Hello, everyone. I am Shaonli Bhowmik. I am a doctoral research scholar at the Center for English Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Um, so, as Ritam has told it earlier, that it's an initiative by three of us, and we are very happy that you guys have joined. So, today, as our guest, we have Dr. Madhumita Majumdar with us. She's an associate professor and the head of the department of the English department at Diamond Harbour Women's University. With a teaching career spanning over 21 years, Dr. Majumdar specializes in British Victorian literature, the long 19th century, gender, queer studies, Renaissance literature, and Dalit and Indian English literature. So her research interests encompass a broad interdisciplinary range, including climate fiction, memory studies, post-colonial literary discourses. She has published widely in national and international journals, and she has actively contributed to the academic discourse through numerous seminars, invited lectures, and conference presentations. We are very lucky and as well as very honored to have ma'am with us today. So today I welcome, and now I'm welcoming her to deliver a lecture, and I'm handing the stage over to her. Over to you, ma'am.
A very good evening, and of course, I would like to congratulate all three of you for actually thinking of such a forum, because as Victorians, if people interested, we can perhaps, develop it into a more interesting format. I mean, I'm really happy and honored to be part of this beginning. And just a slight correction, I no longer hold the position or the chair of the head at present. So I think that was a bit dated uh, uh, bio that you had with you, but nonetheless, I definitely continue to teach. So the title of my paper, is Oceanic Sensibilities, Gendered Waters and Empire in the Victorian Imagination. Um, Now, when you talk about Victorian literature and you talk about the pulses, I think you can sense a rhythm when it comes to the word ocean or sea. As the Britain's imperial expansion mode the waves of maritime dominance, the ocean became both a literal and symbolic force in the Victorian cultural imagination. In fiction, water appears as a site of instability, transformation, and uncontrollable, controllable emotion, a space where selfhood dissolves and empire consolidates itself. Recent turns in oceanic studies and blue humanities, as we call it today, have urged academicians, scholars to look beyond the landlocked paradigms and attend to the fluid aesthetics and the politics of water. So here I wish to build on this approach of this oceanic sensibility and understand how Victorian writers represented water as sometimes a feminized, imperial, and emotionally charged domain. So through readings of novels that I would include of the Bronte sisters, I would include Dickens, I would include Hardy, and I would also include certain journals, newspapers of the times. I would try and understand the Victorian policies regarding the ocean and sea that had been largely, contextualized by its expansion, colonial expansion, imperial expansion, maritime trade, technological advancement that was taking place in navigation. So these were not about securing or expanding Britain's maritime empire, but also regulated certain maritime activities, including trade, defense, exploration, and other colonial interests. So during the Victorian era, the British Empire, at the height of its global dominance, as you can say, the sea was central to its power. The British Royal Navy, in particular, was a dominant force, ensuring that the Britain remained had its control over the trade routes, the sea routes, and of course through it, also a control over its military strategies. So, if I'm talking about the naval supremacy policy, the British government prioritized maintaining Royal Navy superiority over other nations, particularly in the context of imperial defense and trade routes. Apart from it, there was also the expansion of the naval infrastructure to secure their dominance over the trade route. Britain expanded its network of naval bases, including strategic locations in Gibraltar, India, the Caribbean, and Africa. So, the Naval Defense Act of 1889, this piece of legislation was passed in response to growing concerns about the strength of the British Navy in comparison to emerging naval powers such as Germany and the United States. So, the Act mandated a policy of naval expansion, ensuring that the Britain maintained a large fleet, large enough to defend its imperial interests and maintain control over the sea routes. Now, of course, we understand that trade is very central to what when we are talking about the sea routes and the ocean routes. The Shipping Act of 1844. This act, focused on regulating the conditions of the British shipping, including ship safety, the treatment of sailors, and the use of steamships for travel and cargo. It's set out to improve the quality of the British maritime transport and expand trade networks by providing incentives to ship owners to build and maintain modern, efficient vessels. The East India Company, of course, while when it began its trade, was not an exclusive trader for Britain until after 1874, but it definitely had a very crucial role in connecting Britain with India, China, and the rest of Asia. So these policies, the maritime policies regulating the shipping goods, including tea, opium, and cotton, were largely designed to protect and support British merchants in these profitable markets. The Royal Geographical Society, that was established in 1830, it became an important institution in promoting and organizing expedition, including those focused on maritime exploration. The Victorian government, if I can use that word in a collective way, supported such expeditions, especially those aimed at mapping uncharted or unknown territories, discovering new sea routes, and collecting scientific data. For example, the expedition to the Arctic, Antarctica, and the African coasts were largely state supported or funded through the society's efforts. The discovery of the new trade routes was motivated by the search, as I am talking, so such as to those of the Pacific, China, and South America. So policies were developed to incentivize these, expeditions. Of course, there is no denying that everything was done with the interest to protect the British colonial control, so that it remained a strong colonial power. There was this scramble for Africa, especially between 1880 to 1914. Victorian policies regarding ocean travels were significantly impacted by the imperial scramble for the colonies in Africa. So British naval power was crucial in securing the territorial positions and possessions of the African coastlines. The policies of naval controls, shipbuilding, military dominance were directed towards establishing this supremacy of the imperial power of Britain, of course, making it a safe passage for trade. Um, so, to curb any kind of a threat that could be posed by other European countries. The Suez Canal, I need to talk about it. The construction of the Suez Canal that was completed in 1869 revolutionized British maritime policies by dramatically shortening the sea route to India and the Far East. So it became a key strategic route for the British Empire, and the Britain took a direct interest in the governance and the protection of this particular canal during the Victorian period. And this became a symbol of its imperial power. Victorian policies also addressed piracy. So, in key maritime regions, especially along the coasts of Africa and Asia, British naval powers were developed to suppress piracy, which threatened British merchant ships and smooth flow of imperial trade. Additionally, Britain played a central role in the suppression of the transatlantic slave trade. So the British Navy became an active force in stopping slave ships from operating in the Atlantic, enforcing the abolition of the slavery through such maritime patrols. Uh, the Merchant Shipping Act of 1854. This law sought to improve the living and the working conditions of the sailors. It introduced regulations regarding the condition of the ship, the safety of the crew, and there was something which was also called the sailor's right. The 19th century saw some efforts to improve the welfare of the sailors. Now, bringing them together, so what we understand, all these policies were a combination of practical considerations for maintaining imperial control, advancing maritime trade, and fostering scientific and geographical discovery. The sea served as a space for both economic opportunity and imperial defense, where Britain sought to assert its dominance and ensure the protection of its trade routes, colonies, and naval interests. These policies shaped the global maritime landscape, not only securing Britain's empire but also contributing to the broader historical narrative of the Victorian era's imperial and economic power. Now, having sort of given a kind of a, I would say, understanding, a kind of a background to what was happening in terms of laws adapted, policies adapted, I would now veer into a bit of blue humanities and feminist eco-criticism and post-colonial theory and try and understand this oceanic sensibility. At the core of blue humanities, as articulated by thinkers like Steve Menz and Elizabeth D. Longhere, it is a commitment to recentering the ocean in our understanding of cultural and ecological histories. The ocean is merely a space of transit or setting? No. But it is generative, destabilizing force that shapes human experience, planetary systems, and historical memory. So, Men's concept of wet ontology foregrounds the ocean's inherent instability and its capacity to disrupt stable categories, a feature deeply resonant with the affective and gendered ambivalence of the Victorian fiction that I will take up. The feminist eco-critics, including Stacey Alaimo and Astrida Naimanis, have expanded this insights by exploring how bodies, especially female bodies, are porous, fluid, and entangled with larger ecological matrices. Water becomes a figure of the unconscious, of maternal and erotic excess and intercorporeality. This framework, I think, will help us to read the ocean and the riverine imagery in the Victorian literature, not just as a metaphor, but as a material signifier of affective and embodied knowledge. The post-colonial theory will add a crucial geopolitical dimension. Christina Sharp's theory of the wake, and I put that in quotes, conceives the ocean as a site of ongoing historical trauma. particularly in relation to the Middle Passage and its afterlives. So, to talk about its contemporary relevance, I would say the feminist blue humanities emphasizes that environmental degradation, rising sea levels, ocean acidifications are not only ecological but also deeply gendered and radicalized phenomena. So you have to look, if I use Sharp's analysis of the afterlives of slavery and intersect with contemporary sea crossings by climate refugees and displaced people, framing the ocean as a continuing space of mourning, resistance, and uneven mobility. So these insights help reframe Victorian maritime fiction not only as a relic of the past, but as a living archive that speaks to our current ecological and humanitarian crisis. So, uh, a few of the journals or newspapers of that time, were interestingly also commenting on the ocean. The Queen Victoria herself, seldom wrote about the ocean. Her reign was, of course, linked to the sea as a symbol of imperial unity and maternal oversight. But you don't have her talking much on it. The Diamond Jubilee of 1897, for example, celebrated not only Queen Victoria's long reign, but also the maritime routes that connected her dominion. Representations of the Queen in newspapers, such as the Illustrated London News and the Times, often placed her as the center of naval reviews, marine ceremonies, and imperial voyages, aligning her maternal authority with Britain's oceanic insight. So, if I take this idea of hydrocolonial, of course, a term that I'm borrowing from Isabel Hofmeyr, it helped to unpack how the Queen's symbolic femininity softened the violence of colonial expansion by encoding the empire within domestic and gendered imagery. This you know, femininity that is associated with the ocean resonates with literally portrayals of water as emotionally charged and ideologically fraught. In effect, Queen Victoria becomes a figure within the ocean archive, her rule permeating not only the geopolitical but also the affective seascapes of Victorian imagination. Uh, now, uh, there are primary sources, from uh, the Victorian period, where cultural and political stakes of the ocean gets mentioned, even in parliamentary debates. Debates from Hansard's archives frequently invoke the sea in relation to trade, naval strength, and colonial governance. For instance, debates on the Merchant Shipping Act that was in 1894 highlight concerns over labor conditions at the sea safety, and imperial economic policies. So, Victorian newspapers and journals like the Nautical magazine, the Times that I have spoken about, Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine, regularly featured reports, essays, and travelogues that engaged with the oceanic experience. Personal accounts like the Cruise of the Black Prince in 1862 and Lady Brace's A Voice in the Sunbeam in 1878 offered readers romanticized yet revealing depictions of maritime travel. These narratives, often illustrated, helped construct a cultural imagination of the ocean as both sublime and imperial. The Illustrated London News frequently carried maritime illustrations, including depictions of naval reviews and colonial ports, making the empire's seaborne scope visually available to the British public. Now, I'll just break a little here in the sense that, sea side became a popular destination of travel, of course, in the 18th century, mid 18th century, but that would be available only to the wealthy people. But with holiday acts and, other policies coming into effect, this would also become available to the working class. So, these were also places of tourism. So this was also an important thing. And of course, associating going to the seaside, and associating it with health recovery, sea bath, all these things were, things that were beginning to happen, during the Victorian times. And of course, the way that we romanticize the seaside, we talk about spades, we talk about building castles. These are the terms that are, of course, getting into the vocabulary during the Victorian period. Now, continuing with what I was trying to talk about, the post-colonial theory, which can add a crucial geopolitical dimension to the analysis that I'm trying to talk about. Christian and Sharp's theory of the wake, which talks about the historical trauma, particularly as I was talking about. The feminist blue humanities underscores the climate change, ocean degradation, and displacement. These are all deeply gendered and perhaps will help us to understand the kind of fiction that got written. So moving on to some of the fiction that was written during the time, I begin with Villette, that a novel by Charlotte Bronte, which configures the sea as a space of emotional and narrative excess. Lucy Snow's voice is marked by instability and reflection, and the sea becomes a mirror for her interior states. The oceanic scene near the end of the novel, ambiguous and unresolved, serves as a feminine counter narrative to the closure that is so typical of Victorian plots. So, in similarly, if you're moving on to a text like Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, of course it is a landlocked text, as we know, but it employs water imagery to infuse the landscape with a feminist charge. While much of the novel is set in the remote moors, the natural environment is frequently uh, imbued with the qualities of water, such as rain, mist, and fog, metaphors for the emotional and the psychological states of the characters, particularly Catherine Earnshaw. Water here function as a feminized space that mirrors Catherine's passionate and unruly nature. Her love for Heathcliff is turbulent, uncontrollable, as the storms that periodically overtake the novel's landscape. But as Catherine's spirit is indomitable, the floods and the mist that obscure the moors serve as metaphors for the emotional barriers she faces and the unfathomable depths of her desire. The novel's unrelenting engagement with water imagery represents a radical rejection of conventional gender roles, wherein water becomes a force that cannot be subdued or controlled, much like Catherine herself. Moving on to another text of George Eliot, The Mill on the Floss, water is explicitly tied to female experience here, positioning it as both nurturing and annihilating. The river which flows alongside the Tulliver family's mill is both a literal and metaphorical entity in this story. It serves as a source of livelihood and a site of death. The drowning of Maggie Tulliver and her brother Tom at the end of the novel is not simply a tragic conclusion to their story, but a moment of profound feminist and ecological resonance. Maggie's drowning is a return to the elemental forces of water, where she is reconciled not only with her brother, but also with the chaotic and the uncontrollable nature of femininity. The river's role as both as life-giving and life-taking force encapsulates the double-edged nature of water in Victorian narratives. It embodies both maternal care and destructive, annihilating power. The river here symbolizes a feminine space in which the personal and the ecological converge, the forcing characters and readers to confront the complexities of agency, loss, and fate. I take on another text towards the end of the Victorian era. That would be Thomas Hardy's The Return of the Native, which is another instance of water's feminist function, though in a more indirect form. The landscape of Egdon Heath is elemental, yet it is in the moments of rain and flood that Hardy's female characters, such as Eustacia Vi, experience emotional release. Eustatia's yearnings for escape and desire for transformation are mirrored by the unpredictable forces of nature, especially water, which becomes a site of both liberation and constraint. In this way, water acts as a symbol of feminine interiority, capturing the depths of Eustatia's longing, while also rendering her fragile and vulnerable to the larger forces of nature and fate. The rainstorms and the floods that punctuate the novel emphasize water's role as a transformative boundary crossing force, a feminized element that connects the character's emotional states to the rhythms of the natural world. Hardy's use of water, much like that of the Brontes or even George Eliot, highlights water's ambivalence. It is both a conduit for emotional expression and a force capable of overwhelming human agencies. Now, across this text, water is undeniably feminized, not only as a simplistic representation of the female, but as a complex shifting force that embodies the contradictions of gender and ecology. Water is never passive or ornamental. It is dynamic, it is ambiguous, and it is deeply tangled with human subjectivity. It allows the exploration of desire, trauma, and loss in the ways that destabilize normative gender construction and critique the limitations of the Victorian social and the sexual codes. Water in this text function as a feminine space that refuses contentment and instead offers a more fluid, expansive model of subjectivity, one that embraces contradiction, excess, and transformation. In these novels that I've just spoken about, the ocean rivers serve as metaphors for femininity that challenge the traditional binaries of passivity and activity. Rather than merely reflecting female vulnerability, water allows expansion of agency and resistance. By casting water as an element of both destruction and renewal, Victorian writers draw attention to the complex relationship between femininity, power, and nature. So, as these novels reveal, the sea, river, rain are not simply external forces, they are intimately tied to the lives and experiences of these characters, shaping their actions, desires, and fates. Water then becomes a space where the contradictions of empire, gender, and ecology intersect, suggesting that the very fabric of the Victorian narrative is deeply uh, imbued with the ambivalence and the complexity of the oceanic and the feminine. Now, uh, I take up another popular, of course, novelist Charles Dickens, and I would rather take up and prefer to discuss Dombey and Son, which offers, I think, one of the most vivid maritime imageries in the Victorian literature. The sea is ever present, from the drowning of Paul Dombey to the global circuits of trade and the imperial power in which Dombey business is embedded. The ocean is feminized, capricious, powerful, unknowable, but also imperial, making flows of capital and bodies. Dickens complicates the imperial romance of the sea by linking it to emotional trauma and capitalist loss. Paul's death is not simply tragic, it is symbolic of the human costs of modernity and the empire. The death of young Paul Dombey occurs not in isolation, but against a backdrop of expanding imperial capitalism. The Dombey enterprise, reliant on the shipping and trade, reflects the entrenchment of the British mercantile power within global networks of extraction and exchange. Paul's fragility and demands contrast sharply with the hard, profit driven ethos of his father, Mr. Dombey, whose ambitions are aligned with the industrial and maritime might of the British Empire. The sea in this context becomes um, a cubicle of contradictions. It promises movement, expansion, and prosperity on one hand, yet it also enacts loss, dislocation, and emotional rupture. Moreover, Dickens sees the sea with a distinctly affective charge. The maternal association of the sea, its lull, rhythm, and fluidity are interrupted by its cold indifference and destructive power. Paul's fading health and subsequent death evoke a melancholic meditation on childhood, vulnerability, and cost of empire building. The ocean absorbs and reflects these tensions, transforming into an uncanny, quasi sentient space that both nurtures and consumes. In staging maritime space as both a global mechanism of trade and a site of personal devastation, Dickens gestures towards an early critique of imperial capitalism's emotional toll. The maritime setting thus facilitates a complex narrative of power and precarity. Dickens does not merely deploy the sea for dramatic effect, he integrates it into the psychological and ideological fabric of the novel. By binding a familial grief to the imperial commerce, Dombey and Sons situates the sea as a site where economic systems and affective lives converge. This entanglement of emotional and geopolitical currents anticipates the concerns of contemporary oceanic and affective theory, making Dickens a critical figure in the literary genealogy of blue humanities. Now, newspapers and journals of the time often depicted sea not only in relation to imperial expansion, but as also a site of mystery and danger and moral reflection. Victorian periodicals like the Illustrated London News to the Times chronicle the shifting attitude towards this maritime space, blending narrative exploration, commerce, disaster, and also talking about environmental and emotional impacts. As the British Empire expanded, the maritime spaces were often celebrated as symbols of national power, technological progress, and economic prowess. The notion of a civilizing mission was often conveyed through representation of the sea, which was portrayed as a space where Britain's imperial identity could be projected. For example, in the Times, it was frequently discussed that the success of the British maritime industries and their pivotal role in maintaining sorry, the empire's global dominance. Articles on naval exploits, such as those by Admiral Nelson, and on merchant shipping often highlighted the ocean as both a literal and symbolic frontier essential to the expansion of the empire. So, newspapers that I'm talking about, the Illustrated London News or the Graphic, often published vivid accounts of naval disasters, conveying the unpredictability and the harshness of the oceanic life. These reports were filled with emotion and conveyed a sense of vulnerability despite Britain's maritime supremacy. The sea was represented as both as something which was vital, dangerous, uncontrollable. So, this narrative underscored a tension between the ocean's imperial role and its inherent risk, emphasizing the fragility of human life in the face of the nature's vast power. Now, in addition to representing the ocean as a site of imperial power, the Victorian press also engaged with this emotional and psychological dimension. That is something that I talked about. So, the drowning of figures such as Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's consort, whose death in 1861 was widely covered, was frequently linked to the sea in both literal and metaphorical terms. For instance, the Times and the Graphic both published reflections on the emotional toll of Prince Albert's death, drawing connections between the grieving process and the vast, uncontrollable nature of the sea. The sea, much like the royal family's mourning, was depicted as a place where private grief met public spectacle and personal loss was magnified by the scale and the power of the water. The press also covered the emotional turmoil surrounding major maritime disasters, such as the sinking of the Titanic in 1912, which was, of course, a little beyond the Victorian period, but definitely such a discourse was heavily influenced by the maritime discourse of the Victorian period. Even before this infamous event, earlier maritime disasters such as shipwrecks off the coast of Africa or in the Indian Ocean were routinely documented with intense focus on the human cost. Articles frequently emphasized the helplessness and anguish of passengers and crews, mirroring literary treatments of the ocean as a site of both personal and collective tragedy. The figure of the drowned or the lost sailor, often a victim of the sea's impeccable or uncontrollable force, was a recurrent trope in both journalistic writing and Victorian literature. An interesting thread in the Victorian press was the growing discourse around women and ocean. As maritime sensibility was increasingly gendered in literature, periodicals also reflected the role of women within maritime and oceanic spaces. Articles from journals such as The Spectator, The Quarterly Review began to reflect on how women, particularly in colonial contexts, interacted with the sea. Some discussion focused on perceived frailty of women at sea, emphasizing their vulnerability and emotional responses to oceanic environments. Yet, there was a more complex and emerging narrative about women's agency in relation to the sea as evidenced in the rising popularity of women's travel writing and adventure novels that depicted women embarking on ocean voyages. In the later part of the Victorian period, discussions surrounding the suffrage movement and the women's rights were reflected in the maritime discourse as well. The sea, often seen as an unstable, ungovernable force, mirrored feminist critics of the time of women's desire to break free from the confines of Victorian social structures. Feminist authors like Mary Wollstonecraft had already planted seeds for questioning the role of women in the empire, and by the late 19th century, the oceanic or the ocean was becoming a metaphor for women's liberation, resistance, and self realization. While journals in the early part of the century often depicted the sea as a place of fragility for women, later periodicals began exploring how women's interaction with the maritime space could represent empowerment, autonomy, and resistance to patriarchal control. So, towards by incorporating these references of the periodical writings and the journalistic reports, I wish to situate, the Victorian literary representations of the ocean within the broader context of public discourse on maritime power, imperial dominance, emotional response, and ecological concern. The ocean, as both a physical and symbolic space, was deeply embedded in the cultural consciousness of the Victorian period. In particular, the Victorian, press was, of course, reporting, as I said, a number of the naval disasters, including SS Princess Alice, which sank in 1854. The Illustrated London News published detailed account of the disaster, focusing on the grief and the mourning of those left behind. The victims of these tragedies were often portrayed as innocent souls caught in the unfathomable violence of the sea. The emotional language used in these reports were laden with themes of loss, mourning, and helplessness, underscoring the deep emotional resonance that the ocean held for the Victorians. So, the in Victorian literature, sea was feminized, capricious, vast, and powerful, and the periodicals often mirrored this representation. Quarterly Review and The Spectator published articles that explored the complex relationship between women and the ocean. Women were depicted as particularly vulnerable at the sea that we had spoken about. Once again, interestingly, These very newspapers, that is the Illustrated London, the Graphic, began to report on the environmental degradation caused by the industrial activities, including pollution of coastal waters and the overexploitation of the marine resources. Articles began to note the consequences of unregulated maritime trades, particularly in relation to the destruction of the marine ecology or ecosystems, including the depletion of fish stocks and the fouling of ocean waters with the waste from British factories. And of course, this would get reflected in poems and a number of other articles also. These early reports were infused with the sense of urgency and moral responsibility, as environmental degradation was framed not only as a threat to the health of the ocean, but as a direct consequence of British capitalist and imperial practices. The ocean, once an emblem of the Britain's imperial success, began to be framed as a vulnerable entity impacted by the very systems that had enabled Britain's global dominance. This discussion, although not fully yet developed during the time that I'm talking about, laid the groundwork for later environmental movements and contributed to the growing awareness of the ocean's fragility in the face of industrialization. So it was just not a physical force, but a metaphorical space for the Victorians. The sea became a metaphorical wake, I put this word wake in quote unquote, for the empire itself, reflecting not only the emotional cost of imperialism, but also the broader historical processes of colonization, exploitation, and displacement. In this way, Victorians' engagement with the ocean in the press was marked by a tension between celebration and mourning, triumph and loss, reflecting both the imperial ambitions of the British Empire and the human and the environmental cost associated with it. Of course, uh, ocean travelogues were essential vehicle for promoting and consolidating the British imperial power. British travelers, especially those traveling to the colonies, were often encouraged to write about their journeys, not only for their personal or professional benefit, but also as a form of imperial documentation. These travel narratives contributed to the colonial project by portraying Britain's global presence as inevitable, authoritative, and morally justified. Works such as those written by Isabel L. Bird, Richard Francis Burton, John Hanning, chronicle journeys to faraway colonies in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, with the ocean often functioning as the passage with imperial subjects were encountered and brought back into the fold of British cultural and political imagination. When I talk about Isabel Elberts, the English woman in America in 1856, that it was written, and A Lady's Life in the Rocky Mountains, 1879, chronicled her travels to North America, often focusing on the dramatic experiences of crossing the sea or the ocean to reach distant lands. Though Bird's travels were framed as personal adventures, the sea in her accounts is often depicted as an arena for witnessing imperial expansion, where the vastness of the ocean mirrors the empire's expansive reach. The journey across the water was more than a passage, it was part of the larger imperial narrative that helped solidify Britain's geopolitical power. So, in this work, the ocean is dynamic, contested space, not only in terms of geography, but also in terms of gender and cultural dominance. Female writers or travelers like Bird were often simultaneously constrained and empowered by the act of navigating the seas. On one hand, women's voyages across the ocean mirrored traditional gendered roles of female vulnerability and dependency on male authority, such as in the case of ship captains and guides. Yet, on the other hand, these travelogues also provided a space where women's voices could claim authority, offering a rare occasion for their adventurous spirit and intellectual capabilities to be documented and celebrated. So, Victorian travelogues were profoundly engaged with the aesthetics of the sea, the ocean's beauty and the power, depicted as a sight of awe and terror. In some travelogues, the sea was represented as sublime, uncontrollable, an environment where human power was rendered insignificant in the face of natural forces. So you have Richard Francis Burton's first footsteps in East Africa in 1856, or Thomas Trowart's The Edinburgh Lectures on Mental Science, that was in 1904, offering or describing the ocean in terms of its grandeur, instability, and capacity to inspire both fear and wonder. So, the Victorian construction of the ocean in terms of femininity is both powerful and mysterious, but ultimately unknowable. This feminization was frequently paired with narrative of navigation and control, as imperial figures, both male and female, attempted to harness the ocean and make it subservient to the human will. The ocean was often portrayed as unruly, seductive force that had to be subdued by proper application of Victorian masculinity, whether in terms of military might, mercantile enterprise, or scientific exploration. In works like The Voyage of the Beagle by Charles Darwin, the ocean is depicted as a space of scientific discovery where the sea provides a vast fluid field for the collection of data about natural history. This scientific approach to the sea, however, was also deeply gendered, as it was male explorers and naturalists who were authorized to explore, document, and tame the ocean in a way that served both imperial and intellectual goals. So these texts are important not only as records of imperial exploration or as personal narratives of adventure, they also shaped the broader cultural imagination about the sea. The travelers' encounters with the sea were never merely about reaching distant shores. They were about navigating the emotional, psychological, and cultural turbulence of sea as a dynamic process. So the Victorian press was crucial, as well as the Victorian literature, in shaping the public's understanding of the ocean, not only as an essential component of British imperial power, but as a space of emotional complexity and emotional vulnerability and ecological crisis. The press contributed to the ocean's representation both as site of power and a place of profound loss. These journalistic portrayals resonated with the literary works of the period, where the ocean served as a complex, feminized, and politically charged terrain, and talking about the tensions between empire, gender, and emotion. In combining literary and journalistic sources, I here wished to highlight how Victorian writers and journalists navigated the ocean as a symbolic and material force, engaging with the broader cultural current of their time. The oceanic sensibilities articulated in the periodicals of the Victorian era helped lay the foundation of a more nuanced understanding of the sea, one that transcended its status as a mere backdrop and recognized it as an active shaping force in both the imperial and emotional narratives of the 19th century. What emerges across this text is the oceanic sensibility that refuses simple binaries between land and sea, masculine and feminine, empire and the resistant. Victorian fiction often sees this conflict in the ideological machinery of the empire, also registers deep unease about its environmental and emotional cost. The feminized waters of Bronte, Eliot, Hardy, and Dickens offer more than an aesthetic texture. They encode a politics of affect, a critique of imperial violence, and an early reckoning with the ecological precarity. Situating these literary waters within these frameworks, the ocean in Victorian literature, I would argue, is more than atmospheric backdrops. They serve as dynamic, gendered spaces through which the narratives of empire and emotion, as well as gender, converge. By examining the oceanic and this fluvial landscape as feminist, ecological, and imperial sites, I wished also to demonstrate how the Victorian fiction anticipates many of the concerns that are central to contemporary environmental and post-colonial studies. Through the lens of the blue humanities, feminist eco-criticism, and post-colonial studies, we have seen how the sea functions as a site of both loss and resistance, reflecting the emotional and political legacies of empire. The feminized waters in the novels where the storm-laden seas of Willet or the drowning river in the middle of the Floss or the tumultuous landscape of Wuthering Heights allow us to read Victorian literature not as an archive of imperial complexity, but also as a space where the contradictions of empire and ecological degradation are quietly critiqued. The interplay between water, gender, and empire in this text offers valuable insight in the ways in which the Victorian period grappled with ecological, emotional, and geopolitical consequences of the imperial modernity. In particular, the works of Dickens, Eliot, Bronte, and Hardy provide a rich terrain of exploring how the oceanic and the water spaces of the 19th century functioned as a site of both emotional rupture and resistance to imperial power. By reviewing these narratives through the framework of oceanic sensibility, I wish to highlight how the Victorian Sea, often feminized and linked to the imperial power, can also be read as a space of mourning, transformation, and critique. Ultimately, ocean in Victorian literature is more than a metaphor for the empire. It is an active, contested space where affective and ecological concerns intertwine. This sensibility, attuned to both the emotional and the political resonances of water, invites us to reconsider the Victorian Sea not as a distant relic of the past, but as a vital part of our ongoing global conversation about empire, ecological crisis, and the emotional legacies of history. By engaging with the waters of the Victorian fiction, we can open up new avenues for understanding the entanglement of gender, empire, and ecology, not in the past, but also in the concerns of the present as well as the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your enriching lecture. I think all of us enjoyed the lecture a lot. So I really like the fact that how you encompassed, I think, the major writers of Victorian era and try to relate them with the oceanists. Was that too? That is something that I really liked, and how you put in bits and snippets of some things which are never talked about. For example, the Suez Canal. I think there are very few literature that I have read about the Suez Canal because it is not considered to be something that is worth talked about. So I really like that. And also one thing that and also I really love the idea that you put forward about the droning women, specifically in the paintings of Hudson or um what I mean specifically the paintings which have depicted this image of drowning women over and how this imagery has always found its way through this literature of that era is something that worth very noticing. One question that I wanted to ask you was that you looked at water as a very feminized body. You looked at what the ocean as a place for socio political contestation, but then as the entirety of the water, you looked at it as a feminized body. And that's by its feminized entity, it destabilizes and topples the gender hierarchy that is there. But there are some novels like Dickens's novels or Hardy's novel, you will find that the male characters are a bit loners. They do not interact specifically with the women characters. The women characters come to us through monologues. We do not see them interacting directly to the male characters. So when we are talking about water as a feminized entity, can we take this monologic expression of women in the novels in our conversations as well? One. Secondly, I wanted to ask you that when you are talking about the feminized notion of water, are you specifically talking about the ocean? Are you talking about the other forms of water as well, like drizzles, dripples, vapors, the other forms of water that are not talked about? That we see that specifically the upcoming book that we have also Blue Victorian, the majority of the paper that we received were on oceans. But that is also a presumption with Blue Humanities as well that other forms of waters are not something that is talked about or emphasized that much. So I wanted to know your perspective on the. I think while talking about the mill and the floors, you were talking about drizzles, vapors, and waters. So I wanted to know your perspective on it. That is my question for you. And after answering that, I think we'll open the stage for others to talk as well.
Sure. Now, one reason, I was, looking at this whole process of water as a bit feminized, because in the kind of nature study you know, that was being projected at the Victorian period would be mostly observing, nature as something which is feminine. So, and therefore, what I found, or what I think is interesting, that when you look at something which is fluid, which is not restrictive, and since the women's role and expectation in the Victorian period were like very specified, it was like a block. Therefore, this is like a kind of a counter, a kind of a subversion of that image. So therefore, that happens. And I think, this monologues that you're talking about, and men not interacting with women, is also uh, the way that perhaps men and women are reacting very differently to nature. That is why I was talking about, the explorer or the adventurer part is still, supposed to be very masculine, and this is still supposed to be a kind of a very male terrain, and it is not something which is feminine. So the woman is at best, something who can be a traveler, or take aid of these services which are available. So, I think that is one of the reasons perhaps men are uncomfortable talking with women who have strong opinions about nature, and perhaps do not, they will not be able to, I think, the point of
Oppressed or subdued.
yes, that point of convergence will not be there. So that is one thing. And yes, when you're talking about the other forms, even like, one reason I think ocean and sea keep on coming and we don't talk about drizzles, etc., because the moment you talk about something which is unknown, or or something which is not measurable in that way, I
Hmm.
think, to add I think words or adjective to it is much more easier. And perhaps, perhaps even to absolutize it, to talk about it, that it is, it is, it can be terrible, or it can be aesthetic. You can have these concrete words. But when you're talking about other kinds of water, you're talking about drizzles, you're talking about the dew on the flowers. These involve very private and, one-on exploration of that particular character. So therefore, it is difficult, perhaps to concretize and say that this is exactly, this. So how, perhaps I would love the dews on the wild mountain flowers,
Yeah.
but perhaps, not like it on, or somewhere else. So the drizzle, the drizzle could be very something which could be very romantic given at a particular point, but it could be disturbing, if on other points. So this is where perhaps, when scholars of blue humanities are talking, they are not able to perhaps give that kind of absolute
Yeah.
terms to it. But these are definite, worthy of exploration.
Yeah. So yeah, ma'am, that was a very well, I mean, a brilliant answer. So now it's the stage is open to the audience. You can ask ma'am any question regarding the lecture she offered today. You can raise your hands, or like you can unmute yourself. So Shubarna Rekha is asking a question. So yeah, Shubarna Rekha, you can unmute yourself.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, ma'am. Thank you for such a beautiful lecture on the blue humanities. Now, my question is on the exploration itself. If we if we do not focus on the imperial part, my question is about the HMS Beagle and Charles Darwin. So you talked about that it has an imperial touch because the explorers were male. But if we look at ocean as, as an embodiment of consciousness,